April 25th, 1945. The small Bavarian town of Dachau sat under grey skies that seemed to press down on the cobblestone streets like a physical weight. Corporal James "Jimmy" Washington of the 761st Tank Battalion, 3rd Army, moved through the quiet streets with his rifle at the ready, his boots echoing in the eerie silence that had replaced the sounds of conflict just hours before. He had crossed an ocean, survived the beaches of France, pushed through the bitter winter campaign, and now stood on German soil with the certainty that victory was just days away. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have imagined as he turned the corner onto Hauptstrasse, was that in the next few minutes, his understanding of everything he had been fighting for would transform from abstract principle into devastating, immediate reality. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one moment of discovery would unite two people across an ocean of difference, how the liberation of a single person would come to represent the collision of three distinct forms of persecution, and how the simple act of human kindness, in the face of incomprehensible cruelty, would create a bond that would last a lifetime. Jimmy Washington had been born in Birmingham, Alabama, 23 years before that April day in Germany. His world had been one of clearly marked boundaries, of knowing which water fountains he could drink from and which doors were not meant for him. He had grown up understanding that his skin color determined where he could sit, where he could eat, where he could sleep. His mother, Clara Washington, worked as a domestic servant for a white family on the north side of town, coming home each evening with stories that taught him the careful dance of survival in a world that had decided his worth before he had taken his first breath. When the call for volunteers had come in 1942, Jimmy had been working at the steel mill, a job that paid decent wages but offered little in the way of dignity or advancement. The military had been desperate for men, and for the first time in his life, Jimmy had felt genuinely wanted by his country. The irony was not lost on him that America needed him to fight for freedoms abroad that he did not fully possess at home. But his father, Marcus Washington, a veteran of the First World War, had sat him down at their kitchen table and spoken words that had stayed with him through every mile he had traveled since. Marcus had said, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, that sometimes a man had to fight for what should be, not just for what was. He had said that every battle won against tyranny anywhere made the battle for justice everywhere just a little bit easier. He had said that wearing that uniform meant something, meant proving something, meant being part of something larger than the daily humiliations of Jim Crow Alabama. So Jimmy had enlisted. He had endured basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the barracks were segregated and the officers were white, and the opportunities for advancement were limited by policies that assumed his incompetence before he had a chance to prove his worth. He had learned to drive and maintain the M4 Sherman tank, a 30-ton beast of steel and fury that required skill, coordination, and courage to operate effectively. He had excelled at it, his mechanical aptitude and steady nerves making him one of the top students in his class. The 761st Tank Battalion had been activated in March of 1942, one of the first separate tank battalions composed entirely of black enlisted men under the command of white officers. They had trained for 2 years, proving themselves again and again in exercises and drills, always aware that they were being watched more closely, judged more harshly, held to higher standards than their white counterparts. When they finally shipped out to Europe in August of 1944, they carried with them not just the hopes of their families and communities, but the weight of representing their entire race in combat. They had landed in France in October, and by November they were attached to the 26th Infantry Division, pushing through the brutal Lorraine campaign. The mud had been thick enough to swallow a man to his knees. The cold had been the kind that made your bones ache, and your fingers too numb to properly load shells into the tank's main gun. The German forces had been desperate and fierce, fighting for every village, every hill, every meter of ground, with the ferocity of men who knew they were losing but refused to accept defeat. Jimmy had seen his first real combat near the town of Dieuze in mid-November. His tank, christened Dark Destroyer by its crew, had rolled into an ambush that had left 2 other Shermans burning wrecks, and claimed the lives of 8 men he had eaten breakfast with that morning. He had watched tracer rounds arc through the winter sky like deadly fireworks. He had felt the impact of shells striking the armor plating. Each hit a hammer blow that made his teeth rattle and his heart pound. He had seen the flash of the anti-tank gun that had taken out the tank beside him, had seen the crew bail out with their uniforms on fire, had heard screams that still visited him in his dreams. But his crew had held together. His driver, Private First Class Robert Bobby Jenkins from Detroit, had kept the tank moving, weaving between cover, presenting the smallest possible target. His gunner, Sergeant William Willie Thompson from Chicago, had acquired the enemy position and put 3 rounds of high explosive directly into the farmhouse where the anti-tank gun had been positioned. His loader, Private Marcus Littleman Johnson from Atlanta, had kept the ammunition coming with mechanical efficiency, despite the chaos around them. And Jimmy, as the tank commander, had kept his voice steady over the intercom, directing their movements, calling out targets, holding his crew together through sheer force of will. They had survived that day and the days after. They had pushed through France and into Germany, crossing the Rhine River in late March of 1945 as part of the massive Allied push into the heartland of Germany. By then, they were veterans, tested and proven, with a record of combat effectiveness that had earned them respect from the infantry units they supported, and grudging acknowledgement from officers who had expected them to fail. But nothing in Jimmy's experience, not the segregated South, not the grinding discrimination of the military, not the brutal reality of mechanized combat, had prepared him for what he would encounter on that quiet street in Dachau. The town had been taken without significant resistance. The German forces in the area had either retreated or surrendered, and the local population had mostly remained in their homes, peeking through curtains at the American troops that now occupied their streets. Jimmy's battalion had been ordered to secure the area and search for any remaining hostile forces or military assets. It was routine work, the kind of mop-up operation that had become familiar in the final weeks of the campaign. He was walking with his squad, 5 men total, moving through the commercial district of the town. The shops were mostly closed, their windows sometimes broken, their shelves often empty. The war had clearly taken its toll on the civilian population. Food was scarce, fuel was scarce, hope was scarce. The faces that watched them from windows showed exhaustion and fear, and the blank resignation of people who had lived through years of propaganda and sacrifice and were now confronted with the reality of defeat. They turned onto Hauptstrasse, the main street, passing a bakery that no longer had anything to bake, a butcher shop that had no meat to sell, a pharmacy with empty display cases. The street was lined with traditional German buildings, their timber frames and white plaster walls giving them the appearance of illustrations from a fairy tale, though the reality of the war had stripped away any sense of enchantment. That was when Jimmy saw her. At first he thought it was a scarecrow or some kind of mannequin. She was tied to a wooden post in the small square where Hauptstrasse intersected with a side street, her arms bound behind her around the post, her body sagging forward as much as the ropes would allow. She was wearing what had once been a dress, though it was now so filthy and torn that it was barely recognizable as clothing. Her hair was matted and dark, hanging down to obscure her face. Around her neck hung a sign, crude letters painted in black on white cardboard. Bobby Jenkins, walking beside Jimmy, saw her at the same time. He said, his voice tight, that they had another one, asking what was wrong with these people. Willie Thompson, bringing up the rear of the group, moved forward quickly, his medical training from his pre-war job as an orderly, making him immediately assess the situation for signs of life. Jimmy approached cautiously, his rifle still ready, scanning the windows and doorways around the square for any signs of threat. The German population had been unpredictable in these final days. Some welcomed liberation, some resisted, some simply waited to see which way the wind would blow. He had learned to trust nothing and no one until a situation was fully assessed. As he got closer, he could see that she was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow movements. She was alive, though clearly in distress. Her feet were bare and filthy, her legs showing bruises and scrapes that suggested rough treatment. The ropes that bound her were thick hemp, tied tightly enough that they had cut into her wrists, leaving dark marks on her pale skin. It was the sign around her neck that made Jimmy's blood run cold. It was written in German, but he had picked up enough of the language during the months of occupation to understand the meaning. Nicht rein, it said, not pure. And below that, in smaller letters, Judin, Jew. Willie reached her first, kneeling down to check for a pulse at her neck, his dark fingers gentle against her pale skin. He said, speaking to Jimmy, that she was alive but in bad shape, dehydrated for sure, maybe hypothermic, and they needed to get her down and get some water into her right away. He asked Little Man to get the medic, to tell him they had a civilian in critical condition. Jimmy moved forward, pulling out his combat knife to cut the ropes. As he reached for the bindings, the woman's head lifted slightly, and for the first time, he saw her face. She was young, maybe 19 or 20 years old, with features that might have been beautiful if they had not been so ravaged by suffering. Her eyes, dark and huge in her gaunt face, focused on him with an expression that was equal parts terror and confusion. She saw his face, his dark skin, his American uniform, and something in her expression shifted, though whether toward hope or greater fear, he could not immediately tell. He said, speaking slowly and clearly, that it was okay, that they were Americans, that she was safe now. He repeated it in the few words of German he knew, though his accent was terrible, and he was not sure she understood. He said they were going to help her, that they were going to get her down and get her some water and medical attention. She did not respond, but her eyes tracked his movements as he began cutting the ropes. The knife was sharp and the hemp parted easily, but he worked carefully, trying not to jar her or cause her additional pain. When the first rope fell away, she sagged forward, and Willie caught her, supporting her weight as Jimmy cut through the remaining bindings. As soon as she was free, her legs buckled completely. She had clearly been tied to that post for hours, possibly days, and her circulation was severely compromised. Willie lowered her gently to the cobblestones, positioning her on her side in case she vomited, talking to her in a low, soothing voice, even though she probably could not understand his words. The tone was what mattered, the gentleness, the reassurance. Bobby had retrieved his canteen and was holding it ready. Jimmy took it and held it to her lips, tilting it carefully so that just a small amount of water trickled into her mouth. She coughed at first, then began to drink more eagerly, her hands coming up weakly to grasp the canteen, to hold it closer. Jimmy said, pulling it back gently, that she needed to go slow, that too much too fast would make her sick. She did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture, the kindness in his eyes, the concern in his touch. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something change in her expression, saw recognition of some kind, though of what, he could not say. The medic arrived, a white soldier from Mississippi named Collins, who had made his views on serving with black troops abundantly clear during training, but who had learned, through the hard education of combat, that competence and courage came in all colors. He knelt beside the woman, checking her vitals, examining her for obvious injuries, his hands professional and efficient, despite whatever personal prejudices he might harbor. Collins said, looking up at Jimmy, that she was severely malnourished, dehydrated, with possible pneumonia, and definitely suffering from exposure. He said they needed to get her to the aid station immediately, that she needed IV fluids and antibiotics, and a proper examination. He asked how long she had been tied to the post. Jimmy said he did not know, but judging by her condition, it had been at least a couple of days, maybe longer. He pointed to the sign still lying on the ground where it had fallen when Willie had removed it from around her neck. He said, his voice hard, that this was what they had been fighting against. This was what all the propaganda and training films had tried to explain but could never really capture. The simple, brutal reality of treating human beings like this because of their religion or their race. Willie said, his voice quiet but intense, that it reminded him of home, of the photos his grandfather had shown him from the South after the Civil War, of the lynchings and the casual cruelty, of the way some people could look at another human being and see only an excuse for violence. He said at least now they knew why they were here, why they had crossed an ocean and endured months of combat, and watched friends die. This was why. This woman, tied to a post in a German town square like a common criminal for the crime of being born wrong. Bobby added, his jaw tight, that maybe after this, after the world saw what happened when you let hate run wild, when you let people be treated as less than human, maybe things would change back home too. Maybe people would see that the same poison that created this horror in Germany existed in Alabama and Mississippi and 100 other places where the color of your skin determined your worth. Jimmy did not respond to that. He wanted to believe it, wanted to think that exposing this evil would somehow make Americans reconsider their own systems of discrimination and oppression. But he had been disappointed before, had seen how easily people could condemn atrocity abroad while practicing it at home. Still, in that moment, kneeling on the cobblestones of a German town with this woman between them, he felt a connection that transcended nationality or race or religion. They were all victims of the same fundamental evil, the belief that some people were simply less human than others. Collins called for a stretcher, and 2 soldiers from the infantry unit that was securing the town arrived with one. They loaded the woman carefully, and Collins instructed them to take her to the field hospital that had been set up in a church on the edge of town. As they lifted the stretcher, the woman's hand reached out, grasping Jimmy's sleeve with surprising strength. She said something in German, her voice barely above a whisper, raw and hoarse from disuse and thirst. Jimmy leaned closer, and she repeated it. He did not understand all the words, but he caught "Danke," thank you, and saw in her eyes something he had not seen before, something beyond fear or confusion. He saw gratitude, profound and overwhelming, the gratitude of someone who had been pulled back from the edge of an abyss. He said, squeezing her hand gently, that she did not need to thank him, that any decent person would have done the same. He said she was safe now, that no one would hurt her again, that the people who had done this to her were finished. He said it in English, knowing she probably did not understand, but hoping the tone carried the meaning. She held his hand for another moment, her dark eyes locked on his dark skin, and he wondered what she was thinking, what connections she was making in her traumatized mind. Then she released him, and the stretcher-bearers carried her away toward the hospital, leaving Jimmy standing in the square with his squad, looking at the post where she had been tied, at the rope lying in coils on the ground, at the sign with its hateful message. Willie picked up the sign, looking at it with disgust. He said, asking Jimmy what they should do with it, whether they should keep it as evidence or burn it or what. Jimmy thought about it for a moment, then told him to keep it, to make sure it got to the right people, to whoever was going to be documenting these crimes. He said that people needed to see this, needed to understand that this was not just about armies and battles and strategic objectives. This was about ordinary people, individuals with names and faces and lives, who had been targeted for elimination simply because of who they were. The squad continued their patrol, but Jimmy's mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing the woman's face, her eyes, the way she had looked at him when he cut her free. He kept thinking about the sign, about the casual cruelty of it, about the people who had tied her to that post and walked away, leaving her to suffer and possibly die in full view of their neighbors. That evening, after his squad had returned to their bivouac area on the edge of town, Jimmy asked Lieutenant Morrison, their platoon leader, about the woman. Morrison was a decent officer, better than most in his treatment of his men, though still a product of his time and place. He said that according to the medical staff, she was stable but in serious condition. She had been severely beaten before being tied to the post, probably 2 or 3 days ago. She had multiple broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and extensive bruising. She had been dehydrated to the point of organ failure, and the exposure had brought her close to death. Morrison said, his voice tight with anger, that the doctors were amazed she had survived at all. He said that in stronger terms that reflected his own outrage, that the investigation of the local population had revealed that the woman had been hiding in a cellar for weeks, maybe months, that she had been discovered by some of the townspeople and turned over to the local authorities, who had decided to make an example of her. He said that by the time American forces arrived, she had been tied to that post for approximately 60 hours without food or water or shelter. Jimmy asked what would happen to the people responsible. Morrison said that the military government teams were interviewing witnesses and building cases for prosecution. He said that the woman, once she was well enough, would be asked to provide testimony. He said that justice would be served, though both men knew that justice in the chaos of post-conflict Germany was often incomplete and imperfect. Over the next several days, as the battalion waited for orders to move forward toward the Alpine regions, where rumors suggested the German forces might make a last stand, Jimmy found himself thinking constantly about the woman. He learned from the medical staff that her name was Rachel Goldstein, that she was 19 years old, that she had lived in Munich before the conflict began. Her parents had been taken away in 1942, transported to one of the camps that the Allies were now discovering and documenting in all their horror. She had survived by hiding, moving from place to place, relying on the kindness of strangers who risked their own lives to shelter her. She had been in Dachau for 3 months, hiding in the cellar of a house whose owner had been killed during an air raid. She had been living on what little food she could scavenge, staying hidden during the day, only emerging at night to search for sustenance. A neighbor had noticed her, had reported her to the local authorities, and the rest had followed with brutal efficiency. Jimmy visited her once, 6 days after they had found her, when the battalion received word that they would be moving out soon. The field hospital was crowded with casualties, both military and civilian, the staff working around the clock to provide care with limited resources. He found her in a corner bed, propped up with pillows, looking dramatically better than when he had last seen her, but still bearing the visible marks of her ordeal. Her face lit up when she saw him, recognition immediate. She said his name, or tried to, the American pronunciation difficult for her. It came out as Yimmy, and he smiled, telling her that was close enough. He asked, through a translator provided by the hospital staff, how she was feeling. She said through the translator that she was alive, which was more than she had expected a week ago. She said that the doctors told her she would recover fully given time. She said that she wanted to thank him properly for what he had done. She said that when she saw him approaching that day, when she saw his face and realized he was an American soldier, she had thought perhaps she was hallucinating, that her mind was playing tricks on her in the final moments before death. Jimmy, feeling uncomfortable with the gratitude, said that any soldier would have done the same thing. But she shook her head emphatically, saying something rapidly in German that the translator struggled to keep up with. The translator said that Rachel was saying that it meant something special, that it was him specifically who had found her. She said that she had grown up being taught that some people were inferior, that the ideology of the regime had tried to convince her and everyone else that certain races and religions were less than human. She said that seeing him, a black American soldier, risking his life to cross an ocean and fight for her freedom, demonstrating such kindness and humanity, had shattered something in her understanding of the world. She said, her eyes filling with tears, that her entire life she had been told she was inferior because she was Jewish, that she was not worthy of life in the society the regime was building. And here was a man who faced similar hatred in his own country, who had been told his entire life that his skin color made him less valuable, less intelligent, less human. And yet he had traveled thousands of miles to fight against tyranny, had treated her with gentleness and respect, had quite literally saved her life. She said, her voice breaking, that if good men like him existed in the world, then perhaps there was hope for humanity after all. Perhaps the hatred and the evil were not fundamental to human nature, but were diseases that could be cured. Perhaps the vision of a world where people were judged by their character rather than their ancestry was not just a dream, but a possibility. Jimmy found himself unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He thought about his father's words back in Birmingham, about fighting for what should be rather than what is. He thought about every humiliation he had endured, every time he had been forced to use a separate entrance or drink from a separate fountain or sit in the back of a bus. He thought about the rage he had carried with him, the sense of injustice that burned in his chest every time he encountered the casual racism of American society. He said, finally, that he hoped she was right, that he wanted to believe that the world they were fighting to create would be better than the one they had known. He said that seeing what the German regime had done, seeing the systematic cruelty and the industrial-scale hatred, had made him understand that the fight against racism and discrimination was not just an American issue, but a human one. He said that maybe, if enough people saw what happened when hatred was allowed to flourish unchecked, when entire societies embraced the idea that some people were simply less human than others, maybe things would change. He said that he had a younger sister back in Birmingham, 12 years old, smart as a whip and full of dreams. He said that he wanted her to grow up in a world where she could pursue those dreams without being limited by her skin color. He said that he wanted Rachel to have the same opportunity, to rebuild her life without fear, without having to hide who she was. He said that maybe that was what all the fighting and dying had been for, to create the possibility of that world. Rachel reached out and took his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength for someone so recently recovered from near death. She said, through the translator, that she would never forget him, that as long as she lived, she would remember the moment he cut those ropes and offered her water. She said that he had given her back her life, and she intended to use it well, to be worthy of the sacrifice of men like him, who had crossed an ocean to fight for people they had never met. They talked for a while longer, Jimmy telling her about his home in Alabama, about his family, about his hopes for after the conflict ended. Rachel told him what she could remember about her life before, about her parents, about the small joys that had filled her days before the world had gone mad. The translator worked tirelessly between them, bridging not just language but experience, helping two people from vastly different backgrounds find common ground in their shared humanity. When it was time for Jimmy to leave, Rachel made him promise to write to her after the conflict ended, to let her know that he had made it home safely. She said that she planned to emigrate, probably to Palestine or perhaps to America, to start over somewhere that the ghosts of the past did not haunt every street corner. She said she wanted to know that he had returned to his family, had reunited with his sister, had the chance to build the life he deserved. Jimmy promised, though he was not sure how he would find her again in the chaos that would follow Germany's surrender. He gave her his parents' address in Birmingham, telling her that no matter where he was, a letter sent there would find him eventually. He said that he wanted to know what happened to her too, wanted to know that she had found safety and happiness after all she had endured. As he walked out of the hospital, heading back to his unit, Jimmy felt changed somehow. The anger he had carried with him, the sense of injustice and fury at a world that had treated him as less than equal, had not disappeared. But it had been tempered by something else, by a sense of connection and shared purpose. He had seen in the most direct and personal way possible what happened when hatred and discrimination were allowed to grow unchecked. He had seen the logical endpoint of the ideology that said some people were simply less human than others, and he had also seen the power of individual kindness, of simple human decency in the face of systematic cruelty. He had cut through ropes that represented centuries of bigotry and hatred. He had offered water to someone who represented everything the regime had sought to eliminate, and in doing so, he had created a moment of connection that transcended all the artificial boundaries that human beings erected between themselves. The battalion moved out 2 days later, heading south toward Austria as part of the final push to secure the Alpine regions. They would encounter more horrors in the days to come, more evidence of the regime's systematic cruelty. They would liberate smaller camps and discover mass graves and hear stories from survivors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But for Jimmy, that moment in the square in Dachau, the moment he saw Rachel Goldstein tied to that post, remained the defining experience of his time in Europe. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, less than 2 weeks after Jimmy had found Rachel. The news was greeted with celebration and relief, though tempered by the growing understanding of the full scale of the atrocities that had been committed. The camps were being liberated one after another, and the evidence of systematic genocide was overwhelming. The world was beginning to understand that this had not been a conventional conflict between nations, but a war against the very concept of human rights and dignity. Jimmy remained in Germany with the occupation forces through the summer of 1945. His battalion was stationed near Munich, helping to maintain order and support the establishment of military government. It was during this time that he had the opportunity to see Rachel again. She had recovered physically, though the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. She had been relocated to a displaced persons camp near Munich, where survivors from across Germany were being gathered and cared for while decisions were made about their futures. The camps were overcrowded and under-resourced, but they represented safety and the first steps toward rebuilding shattered lives. Jimmy visited her there in July, bringing chocolate and coffee from his rations, luxuries that were still difficult to obtain for the civilian population. The camp was a sprawling collection of temporary buildings and tents, housing thousands of people who had lost everything. The atmosphere was strange, a mixture of grief and relief, of people beginning to process what they had survived while still uncertain about what came next. Rachel was sharing a tent with 5 other women, all survivors of various camps and hiding places. She had gained weight, and her bruises had healed, but her eyes still carried shadows that spoke of experiences too dark to fully articulate. She introduced Jimmy to her tent mates, and he found himself surrounded by women who viewed him with a mixture of curiosity and profound gratitude. To them, the Black American soldiers represented liberation in its purest form, the concrete embodiment of freedom arriving to shatter the chains of oppression. One of the women, an older lady named Sarah, who had survived 2 years in Bergen-Belsen, said through a translator that the arrival of soldiers like Jimmy had been incomprehensible to many of the survivors. She said that the regime's propaganda had taught them that black people were subhuman, that the presence of black soldiers in the American army was evidence of that nation's moral decay. She said that seeing these same soldiers treating survivors with kindness and respect, seeing them risk their lives to liberate camps and provide aid to the displaced, had been a powerful counter to years of indoctrination. She said with tears in her eyes that evil had tried to teach them that humanity could be divided into superior and inferior categories, that some people were worthy of life and dignity, while others deserved only contempt and death. But the Americans had shown them something different. They had shown that true humanity transcended all artificial categories, that compassion and courage came in all colors, and that the content of a person's character was the only measure that mattered. Jimmy found these conversations both humbling and profound. He had come to Europe to fight tyranny, to do his part in defeating an evil regime. He had not expected to become a symbol of something larger, to represent through his simple acts of human kindness a refutation of the very ideology the Allies had been fighting against. But he understood, listening to these women, that his presence and his actions carried meaning beyond the immediate and personal. Rachel told him that she had been accepted for emigration to Palestine, that she would be leaving the camp in September to join a group heading to the British Mandate. She said it was bittersweet, leaving the land where she had been born, where her parents were buried in mass graves she would never be able to visit. But Germany held too many ghosts for her, too many memories of loss and fear. She needed to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere she could build a life without the constant reminders of what had been taken from her. Jimmy told her about his own plans. The military was beginning to demobilize, and he expected to be shipped back to the United States by the end of the year. He said he was looking forward to seeing his family, to reuniting with his parents and his sister. But he also expressed uncertainty about returning to the segregated South after spending time in Europe, where the racism, while still present, was less institutionalized and less comprehensive than what he had known at home. He said that the experience of combat and liberation had changed him, had made it difficult to accept the status quo that he had grown up with. He said that he had crossed an ocean and fought for freedom and democracy, had helped liberate people from systematic oppression, and the idea of returning to a place where he could not eat at the same lunch counter as a white person or vote without facing intimidation felt absurd and infuriating. Rachel said she understood, that she felt a similar disconnection from the idea of returning to normal life. She said that survival created an obligation, that having lived through the worst of human evil meant she had a responsibility to stand against injustice wherever she encountered it. She said that if she could help make the world even slightly better, slightly more just, then perhaps there was meaning in her survival. They made a pact that day, sitting in the displaced persons camp with the late summer sun filtering through the tent flaps. They promised each other that they would use their experiences to fight against hatred and discrimination in whatever forms they encountered it. They promised to remember each other, to carry the memory of their meeting and what it represented into whatever futures they would build. They promised that the connection forged in that town square in Dachau would endure, would serve as a reminder that human dignity transcended all artificial boundaries. Jimmy returned to the United States in December of 1945, landing in New York Harbor with thousands of other veterans returning from Europe. The city celebrated their arrival with parades and ceremonies, with speeches about sacrifice and victory. But when Jimmy boarded the train south to Alabama, he found himself once again in a segregated car, separated from white veterans with whom he had served and fought. The return to American racism was jarring and immediate, a cold dose of reality after the hopes he had harbored that perhaps things might be different after the conflict. Back in Birmingham, he found his family much as he had left them, though marked by the years of worry and waiting. His mother cried when she saw him, holding him as if she could anchor him to safety through sheer force of will. His father shook his hand with quiet pride, his eyes conveying what words could not about what Jimmy's service meant to him. His sister, now 14, looked at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity, seeing him both as her beloved brother and as a stranger who had seen things she could not imagine. The readjustment to civilian life was difficult. Jimmy found work at the same steel mill, where he had been employed before the conflict, but the job felt small and meaningless after the magnitude of what he had experienced. He attended meetings of the local veterans organization, but found the atmosphere uncomfortable. The organization divided along racial lines that felt increasingly intolerable to him. It was at one of these meetings that he met other veterans who felt the same restlessness, the same sense that having fought for freedom abroad, they could not accept continued oppression at home. They began organizing, quietly at first, planning voter registration drives and peaceful protests against segregation. This was years before the civil rights movement would capture national attention, but the seeds were being planted, and veterans like Jimmy were among the gardeners. He received his first letter from Rachel in the spring of 1946. She wrote from a kibbutz in Palestine, describing her new life in a land that was struggling to define its own future. She wrote about the work of building something new from the ashes of destruction, about the challenges of learning a new language and adapting to a dramatically different climate and culture. She wrote about the other survivors she was living with, people who carried similar scars and similar determination to create lives worthy of those who had not survived. She also wrote about how often she thought of that day in Dachau, how the memory of Jimmy's face and his kindness had sustained her through difficult moments. She said that whenever she encountered prejudice or discrimination, whenever she saw people treating others as less than human because of their ethnicity or religion, she thought of him and drew strength from the knowledge that there were people in the world who refused to accept such divisions. Jimmy wrote back, telling her about his return to Alabama, about the strange experience of fighting for democracy abroad only to return to a country that denied him basic rights at home. He told her about the organizing work he was becoming involved in, about the growing determination among black veterans to demand the rights they had fought to protect. He said that her words had inspired him, that knowing she was building a new life gave him hope that change was possible. Their correspondence continued over the years, letters crossing the Atlantic every few months, creating a thread of connection that spanned continents and cultures. They wrote about their lives, their struggles, their hopes for the future. They wrote about the ways the conflict had changed them, about the impossibility of returning to who they had been before. They wrote about the responsibility they felt to honor those who had not survived, to build a world more worthy of the sacrifice that had been made. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Jimmy, now married with 2 young children of his own, wept when he heard the news. It was not complete victory, not by any measure, but it was movement in the right direction, acknowledgement that the legal framework supporting segregation was incompatible with American ideals. He wrote to Rachel that night, telling her about the decision, about what it might mean for his children's future. Rachel wrote back from Israel, which had declared independence in 1948, after a conflict that had defined the borders of the new nation. She told him about the challenges the young country faced, about the ongoing conflicts with neighboring nations, about the difficult process of integrating survivors from across Europe into a functioning society. She said that the work of building a nation dedicated to providing safe haven for people who had been persecuted for their identity was both inspiring and exhausting. But she said that every time she encountered resistance or setback, she thought of his struggle in America, of the way he continued to fight for justice despite the obstacles, and she drew strength from their shared determination. The civil rights movement gained momentum through the late 50s and early 60s. Jimmy participated in sit-ins and freedom rides, using his veteran status and his combat record as a shield against some of the worst violence, though not all. He was beaten during a protest in Birmingham in 1963, spending 3 days in the hospital with cracked ribs and a concussion. His wife wanted him to stop, to think of their children, to stay safe. But he told her what his father had told him years before, that sometimes a man had to fight for what should be, not just for what is. Rachel followed the American civil rights movement from Israel, reading newspaper accounts and watching whatever footage made it to international news programs. She saw in the protesters' courage and determination an echo of the resistance fighters who had opposed the German regime, saw in their non-violent tactics a powerful rebuke to those who believed that power came only from the barrel of a gun. She wrote to Jimmy after the March on Washington in 1963, saying that Martin Luther King's speech about judging people by the content of their character, rather than the color of their skin, resonated deeply with her, echoing the lessons she had learned in that town square in Dachau nearly 2 decades earlier. She said that the struggle for civil rights in America gave her hope that the world was slowly learning the lessons of the conflict, that perhaps humanity was beginning to understand that the divisions between people based on race, religion, or ethnicity were artificial and destructive. She said that if America, with all its economic and military power, could begin to dismantle the structures of racism and discrimination, then perhaps there was hope for other societies to do the same. In 1968, Jimmy was invited to speak at a veterans event commemorating the 23rd anniversary of Germany's surrender. The event was held in Washington, D.C. and for the first time, it was fully integrated, with black and white veterans sharing the same stage, the same hotel, the same dining facilities. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to Jimmy, it represented profound change from the segregated military he had enlisted in 26 years earlier. During his speech, he told the story of finding Rachel Goldstein tied to that post in Dachau. He described the sign around her neck, the brutal simplicity of its message, the way it reduced a human being to a category deemed unworthy of life. He talked about cutting through those ropes, about the moment their eyes met, about the connection that had been forged between them. He said that the experience had taught him something fundamental about the nature of hatred and resistance to it. He said that the same ideology that had tried to eliminate Jewish people in Europe was cousin to the ideology that had enslaved African Americans and continued to oppress them through segregation and discrimination. He said that both were based on the lie that some people were less human than others, that both relied on dehumanization and violence to maintain themselves. He said that the defeat of that German regime had proven that evil, no matter how powerful it appeared, could be overcome when people of conscience stood together against it. He said that the ongoing civil rights movement was proving the same thing in America, that systems of oppression could be dismantled when enough people refused to accept them as inevitable or natural. The speech was well received, and afterwards several reporters asked him about Rachel, about whether they were still in contact, about what had become of her. Jimmy told them that she lived in Israel, that she had married and had children, that she had built a good life after surviving the worst humanity could offer. He said that they still wrote to each other, that the bond forged in that moment of liberation had endured across decades and distance. One of the reporters asked whether he thought the conflict had achieved its purpose, whether the world had learned the lessons it was supposed to teach. Jimmy paused before answering, thinking carefully. He said that the conflict had defeated a particular manifestation of evil, had destroyed a regime built on systematic hatred and genocide. But he said that the underlying disease, the willingness of human beings to divide themselves into categories of us and them, of worthy and unworthy, had not been cured. He said that the same patterns played out in different contexts, in the racism that still plagued America, in conflicts around the world where people killed each other over differences of religion or ethnicity or tribe. He said that vigilance was required, that each generation had to choose whether to accept divisions based on arbitrary characteristics or to insist on the fundamental equality and dignity of all human beings. He said that his children were growing up in a world that was better than the one he had known as a child, but that was not yet the world it should be. He said that Rachel's children were growing up in a country that had been created specifically to provide refuge for people persecuted for their identity, but that still faced existential threats from neighbors who refused to accept its right to exist. He said that the work of building a just world was never finished, that each small victory had to be defended and built upon. The reporter's final question was whether, given the chance to live his life again, he would make the same choices. Jimmy did not hesitate. He said that every difficulty, every moment of discrimination, every risk he had taken had been worth it, because of moments like the one in Dachau, moments when he had been able to embody the principles he believed in, when he had been able to make a concrete difference in another person's life. He said that the opportunity to cut through those ropes, to offer water to a dying woman, to demonstrate through simple acts of kindness that the ideology of hatred was a lie, had given his life meaning beyond anything he could have found in safety and comfort. He said that meeting Rachel, maintaining their friendship across decades, watching her build a life worth living after coming so close to death, had shown him the power of individual action in the face of systematic evil. In 1973, Jimmy and Rachel finally met in person again. He traveled to Israel as part of a delegation of American veterans visiting the country. The moment they saw each other was emotional, both of them now middle-aged, marked by the passage of time and the experiences of nearly 3 decades, but the connection between them as immediate and powerful as it had been in the displaced persons camp in 1945. Rachel introduced him to her husband, David, who had also survived the camps, and to her 2 children, both born in Israel and named for relatives who had not survived. Jimmy introduced his wife and his own children who had made the trip with him. The 2 families spent a week together, sharing meals and stories, building connections of their own. Rachel took Jimmy to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, where the names of millions of victims were recorded and remembered. They walked through the exhibits documenting the rise of the German regime and the systematic persecution of Jewish people. They saw photographs and documents and artifacts that told the story of industrial-scale genocide. They stood together in the Hall of Names, surrounded by pages of testimony for each individual victim, a powerful reminder that these were not statistics, but people, each with their own story, their own dreams, their own families who loved and mourned them. In front of one exhibit, showing photographs of people tied to posts in German towns, their crimes listed on signs around their necks, Rachel began to cry. Jimmy put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together, 2 survivors of different but related forms of oppression, united in their determination to bear witness and to resist amnesia. Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion, that she had spent years trying to make sense of her survival, trying to understand why she had lived when so many others had died. She said that she had concluded that survival carried responsibility, that she was obligated to remember and to teach, to ensure that the world understood what had happened and why it must never be allowed to happen again. She said that meeting Jimmy, being saved by him specifically, had given her life particular direction. She said that the experience had taught her that solidarity across different forms of oppression was essential, that the fight against racism and the fight against anti-Semitism were part of the same larger struggle for human dignity. She said that she had tried to live that principle, to support civil rights movements and anti-discrimination efforts wherever she encountered them. Jimmy said that he had reached similar conclusions about his own life. He said that the experience of finding her, of seeing firsthand the logical endpoint of unchecked hatred, had transformed his understanding of the civil rights struggle. He said that he had understood intellectually that racism was wrong, but seeing Rachel tied to that post, seeing what happened when a society fully embraced the dehumanization of a group of people, had made it visceral and personal in a way that abstract principles never could. He said that in the years since, whenever he had faced violence or intimidation for his civil rights work, whenever he had been tempted to give up or to accept that change was impossible, he thought of her. He thought of her courage in surviving, of her determination to build a meaningful life after losing everything, of her refusal to let hatred define her or limit her humanity. And he found in those thoughts the strength to continue. They spent hours talking that week, comparing their experiences, discussing the different forms that oppression took in their respective countries, exploring the connections between anti-black racism and anti-Semitism. They talked about the ways both ideologies relied on pseudo-scientific theories of racial superiority, on dehumanizing propaganda, on legal frameworks that institutionalized discrimination. They talked about the courage required to resist, about the cost paid by individuals who stood against injustice. One evening, sitting on the porch of Rachel's home in Tel Aviv, watching their children play together in the yard, Rachel asked Jimmy whether he thought progress was real or illusory. She said that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the persistence of hatred, by the way each generation seemed to find new groups to scapegoat and persecute. She said that the Holocaust had been supposed to teach the world that systematic persecution and genocide were unacceptable, but already there were new conflicts, new genocides, new manifestations of ancient hatreds. Jimmy thought carefully before responding. He said that progress was real but fragile, that each advance had to be fought for and defended. He said that his children went to integrated schools, that they grew up in a world that was legally committed to equality, even if practice often fell short of principle. He said that was progress compared to his own childhood, even if it was not yet the full realization of the dream. He said that Rachel herself was evidence of progress, that she had survived when the regime had intended for her to die, that she had built a family and a home in a country that existed specifically to prevent future holocausts. He said that imperfect progress was still progress, that the fact that the world was not yet just did not mean that efforts toward justice were meaningless. He said that the alternative to hope was despair, and despair was exactly what the architects of hatred wanted. They wanted people to believe that discrimination and oppression were natural and inevitable, that resistance was futile, that acceptance was the only realistic option. He said that refusing to accept that narrative, continuing to fight for justice even when progress seemed slow or uncertain, was itself a form of resistance. Rachel nodded, saying that he was right, that she knew he was right, but that some days the weight of memory made hope feel like naivety. Jimmy said he understood, that he felt the same way sometimes, but that they owed it to those who had not survived to continue working toward the world that should be rather than accepting the world that is. The visit ended too soon, as these things always do, but the families promised to maintain contact, to not let decades pass again before seeing each other. Jimmy's children and Rachel's children exchanged addresses and began their own correspondence, creating new threads of connection between the families. Back in the United States, Jimmy continued his work for civil rights and social justice. He had retired from the steel mill and devoted himself full-time to organizing and advocacy. He spoke at schools and community groups, telling stories about the conflict and about the civil rights movement, drawing connections between the two struggles. He always included the story of finding Rachel, using it to illustrate the fundamental similarity between all forms of discrimination and the universal nature of human dignity. In 1991, Jimmy received a phone call that Rachel's husband had passed away after a long illness. He immediately made arrangements to travel to Israel for the funeral, arriving in time to sit with Rachel and her family during the mourning period. The loss was devastating for her, but she drew comfort from the presence of friends and family who had known David and could share memories of his life. During that visit, Rachel told Jimmy that she wanted to do something to commemorate their meeting and what it had represented. She said that she had been thinking about establishing a foundation dedicated to fighting discrimination and promoting cross-cultural understanding. She said that the foundation would tell the story of how a Black American soldier and a Jewish woman had found connection in the midst of horror, how their friendship had demonstrated that human dignity transcended all artificial divisions. Jimmy was moved by the idea and offered to help however he could. Over the next several years, working together despite the distance between them, they established the Washington Goldstein Foundation for Human Dignity. The foundation provided scholarships for students studying civil rights history and Holocaust education, supported grassroots organizing against discrimination, and facilitated dialogue between communities that had experienced different forms of oppression. The Foundation's mission statement, written jointly by Jimmy and Rachel, articulated their shared vision. We believe that all forms of oppression are connected, that the fight against racism and the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight against all discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics are part of the same struggle for human dignity. We believe that solidarity across different experiences of oppression is essential to creating a more just world. We believe that individual acts of kindness and courage can create ripples that transform societies. We believe that remembering the past is not about dwelling on pain, but about learning lessons that can guide us toward a better future. The Foundation's logo was simple but powerful, two hands clasped together, one black and one white, with broken ropes falling away from both wrists. It captured the essence of their story, the moment of liberation and connection that had defined both their lives. In 2005, 60 years after the end of the conflict in Europe, Jimmy and Rachel were invited to speak together at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. The event was titled Bearing Witness: Personal Stories of Liberation and Resistance, and it drew a large crowd of survivors, veterans, students, and community members. They took turns telling their story, Jimmy describing the moment he found her, Rachel describing what she had felt when she saw him approaching, both of them reflecting on how that moment had shaped the decades that followed. They showed photographs from that week in Tel Aviv in 1973, pictures of their families together, visual evidence of the life and connection that had grown from that moment in Dachau. During the question and answer session, a young black woman raised her hand and said that the story had moved her deeply, that she had not previously understood the connections between the Holocaust and the African American civil rights struggle. She said that she had thought of them as separate histories, separate forms of oppression. But listening to Jimmy and Rachel, she understood that they were manifestations of the same fundamental evil, the belief that some people were less human than others. Jimmy said that recognizing those connections was essential to building effective resistance to discrimination in all its forms. He said that when Black Americans and Jewish Americans and all communities that had faced persecution understood their shared stake in fighting oppression, they became more powerful than when they worked in isolation. He said that the architects of hatred wanted marginalized groups to fight with each other, rather than recognize their common interests. Rachel added that the Holocaust had been possible because people who were not Jewish had been convinced that the persecution did not concern them, that it was someone else's problem. She said that the great lesson of that period was that injustice anywhere threatened justice everywhere, that systematic oppression of any group created the conditions for oppression of all groups. She said that when she saw racism in America or anywhere else, she recognized the same patterns that had enabled the Holocaust. She said that when Jimmy saw anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or discrimination against immigrants, he recognized the same patterns that had enabled Jim Crow. She said that this mutual recognition, this ability to see their shared struggle, was what had made their friendship so powerful and so enduring. A young Jewish man asked how they had maintained their connection across so many decades, what had kept their friendship alive despite the distance and the demands of their separate lives. Rachel smiled and said that the bond forged in extreme circumstances had a durability that normal friendships often lacked. She said that when you had seen each other at the worst moments of life, when you had been present for liberation and survival, the connection went deeper than ordinary social relationships. Jimmy added that they had worked at it, that they had prioritized the correspondence and the occasional visits despite busy lives and competing demands. He said that their friendship represented something important to both of them, a tangible reminder that human connection could transcend all the barriers that society erected. He said that maintaining it was not just personally meaningful, but was itself a form of resistance to the forces that sought to divide people. In 2010, Jimmy's health began to decline. He had been diagnosed with lung disease, probably related to decades of exposure to industrial pollutants in the steel mill, and possibly exacerbated by his time breathing tank exhaust during the conflict. Rachel flew to Alabama to visit him, sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand as they reminisced about their shared history. Jimmy said, his voice weak but his mind still sharp, that he was grateful for the life he had lived, for the opportunity to be part of something larger than himself. He said that finding her that day in Dachau had given his life direction and meaning beyond what he could have imagined. He said that their friendship had been one of the great gifts of his life, that knowing her had made him a better person and a more effective advocate for justice. Rachel, tears streaming down her face, said that he had given her back her life, that without him she would have died tied to that post in a German town square. She said that everything she had accomplished, her family, her work, her advocacy, had been possible only because he had cut through those ropes. She said that he was a hero, though she knew he hated that word, that his courage and compassion had rippled out in ways he probably did not fully appreciate. Jimmy smiled weakly and said that he was just a man who had tried to do the right thing when the opportunity presented itself. He said that the real heroism had been hers, surviving when so many had not, building a meaningful life from the ashes of destruction, refusing to let hatred win by limiting her capacity for love and connection. He said that his only regret was that he would not live to see the world they had both worked toward, the world where people truly were judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin or their religion or their ethnicity. But he said that he believed that world was coming, slowly and imperfectly, carried forward by people like their children and grandchildren who had been raised with stories of resistance and solidarity. Rachel promised him that she would continue the work, that the foundation they had built together would carry on, that his story would be told to new generations. She said that she would make sure that people understood what his generation of black veterans had sacrificed, how they had fought for freedom abroad while being denied it at home, how their courage and perseverance had helped create the conditions for the civil rights movement. Jimmy passed away 3 days later, surrounded by his family. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact he had made in his community and beyond. Rachel delivered a eulogy that left few dry eyes in the church, describing their meeting and the decades of friendship that had followed, painting a picture of a man who had embodied the principles he fought for. She said that Jimmy Washington had been a liberator in the most complete sense of the word. He had helped liberate Europe from tyranny, had helped liberate his own people from the legal structure of segregation, and had helped liberate her specifically from certain death. She said that his legacy was not just in the battles fought or the protests attended, but in the countless individual moments when he had chosen compassion over indifference, solidarity over division, hope over despair. The Washington Goldstein Foundation for Human Dignity continued its work, now fully under Rachel's direction with support from both families. The foundation expanded its programs, creating exchange programs that brought together students from different backgrounds to study the Holocaust and the civil rights movement together, to explore the connections between different forms of oppression, to build the cross-cultural understanding that Jimmy and Rachel had embodied. In 2015, the foundation sponsored a pilgrimage to Dachau, bringing together descendants of Holocaust survivors and descendants of Black American veterans who had liberated the camps. The group included Rachel, now 90 years old but still sharp and engaged, and 2 of Jimmy's grandchildren. They walked the streets where he had found her 70 years earlier, trying to imagine that moment, to understand what it had meant. The town had changed dramatically since 1945. It was prosperous and modern, with shops and cafes and tourists who came to visit the former camp that sat on its outskirts. But the street layout was largely the same, and with some research, they were able to identify the exact spot where Rachel had been tied to the post. There was no marker there, no indication that something significant had occurred. It was just a street corner in a German town, indistinguishable from thousands of others. But the group gathered there, forming a circle, and Rachel told them the story. She described what she had felt, tied to that post, expecting to die. She described seeing Jimmy approach, his dark face concerned and determined. She described the sound of his knife cutting through the ropes, the taste of the water he gave her, the gentleness in his eyes. She said that moment had taught her something fundamental about human nature. She said that the years of persecution and hiding had tempted her to believe that humanity was fundamentally evil, that given the opportunity, most people would choose cruelty over kindness. But Jimmy, a man who had every reason to be angry and bitter about his own treatment by his society, had chosen compassion. He had seen a stranger in distress and had responded with immediate, uncomplicated kindness. She said that this was the answer to hatred, not violence or revenge, but simple human decency. She said that the battle against discrimination and oppression was ultimately won not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, though those had their place, but through millions of individual choices to see the humanity in others, to refuse the categories that society tried to impose, to insist on dignity and respect for all people. One of Jimmy's granddaughters, a young woman named Clara, after her great-grandmother, asked Rachel what she thought Jimmy would want his legacy to be. Rachel thought for a moment, then said that he would want to be remembered as someone who had tried to leave the world better than he found it. He would want people to understand that individual actions mattered, that each person had the capacity to make a difference in someone else's life. He would want the connection between different struggles for justice to be understood and honored. Most of all, Rachel said, he would want people to understand that the fight was not over, that each generation had to renew the commitment to justice and dignity, that progress was never permanent or guaranteed. He would want them to draw inspiration from the past, but to focus their energy on the present and future, on the work that remained to be done. The group spent time at the former camp, walking through the memorial, reading the exhibits, confronting the evidence of what had been done there. It was overwhelming and necessary, a reminder of what could happen when hatred and discrimination were allowed to flourish unchecked. But then they returned to that street corner, to the spot where liberation and connection had occurred, and they held a small ceremony of remembrance. They read passages from letters that Jimmy and Rachel had exchanged over the years, sharing their thoughts about justice and resistance and hope. They lit candles, one for Jimmy and one for all the victims of hatred in all its forms. They stood in silence for a time, each person reflecting on what the story meant to them, how it connected to their own experiences and struggles. Then Clara, Jimmy's granddaughter, spoke. She said that she was proud to be the descendant of James Washington, that his story inspired her in her own work for justice. She said that she was a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases, that she had chosen that path in part because of his example. She said that whenever she felt discouraged by how slowly change seemed to come, whenever she was tempted to give up, she thought of him and Rachel, of the connection they had forged and maintained, of the way they had turned personal trauma into lifelong commitment to justice. She said that his story had taught her that resistance to oppression took many forms, that dramatic protests and legal battles were important, but so were the quiet, persistent acts of kindness and solidarity that occurred every day. She said that he had shown her that maintaining your humanity in the face of dehumanization was itself a form of resistance, that refusing to let hatred make you hateful was a victory. Rachel embraced Clara, 2 generations and an ocean of difference between them, united by their connection to a man who had embodied the principles he fought for. She said that seeing the Foundation's work continue, seeing young people like Clara dedicate themselves to justice, gave her hope that the world they had worked toward was slowly coming into being. That evening, the group gathered for dinner at a restaurant in Munich. The conversation was lively and profound, people sharing their own family stories of the conflict and its aftermath, drawing connections between different experiences of oppression and liberation. Rachel sat at the head of the table, presiding over the gathering with quiet authority, occasionally interjecting with stories or observations that added context and depth to the discussion. At one point, someone asked her whether she had ever returned to the cellar where she had hidden for those months in 1945. She said she had not, that she had no desire to revisit that space of fear and desperation. She said that for her, the important site of memory was not the place where she had hidden, but the place where she had been found. Not the space of victimization, but the space of liberation. She said that this was why she had brought the group to that street corner rather than to the cellar, or even primarily to the camp memorial. She said that while it was important to remember and document the atrocities, to ensure that the world understood what had happened and how, it was equally important to remember the moments of resistance and liberation, to celebrate the courage of those who had fought against tyranny, to honor the connections that had been forged in the struggle for justice. She said that her friendship with Jimmy had taught her to focus not just on what had been lost, but on what had been gained, not just on the horrors of the past, but on the possibilities of the future. She said that without minimizing the suffering or forgetting those who had not survived, she had tried to build a life that honored their memory by embodying the values they had died defending. As the evening drew to a close, Rachel raised her glass in a toast. She said that she wanted to honor James Washington, liberator and friend, whose courage and compassion had given her back her life. She said that she wanted to honor all the veterans who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny, particularly the black veterans who had fought for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. She said that she wanted to honor all those who had resisted oppression in all its forms, who had maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanization, who had chosen solidarity over division, and she said that she wanted to challenge everyone at the table to carry forward the work that Jimmy had devoted his life to, the work of building a world where people truly were judged by the content of their character, rather than by arbitrary characteristics beyond their control. She said that this work was never finished, that each generation had to renew the commitment, but that she believed it was possible, that the trajectory of history, however uneven and uncertain, bent toward justice. The toast was met with tears and affirmation, with people around the table nodding and raising their own glasses. In that moment, in a restaurant in Munich 70 years after the end of the conflict, the connection between a black American soldier and a Jewish woman who had met in the worst of circumstances continued to ripple outward, touching lives, inspiring commitment, demonstrating the power of human connection to transcend all barriers. Rachel passed away in 2017 at the age of 91, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in Tel Aviv. Her death was noted in newspapers in Israel and the United States, with obituaries that told her story and her decades of advocacy work. But the most meaningful tribute came at her funeral, when Clara Washington, Jimmy's granddaughter, traveled to Israel to speak. Clara told the assembled mourners about the bond between their families, about how a moment of liberation in a German town had created a connection that had lasted a lifetime and now extended into the next generation. She said that Rachel and Jimmy had shown them all what solidarity across difference looked like, how people from vastly different backgrounds could find common cause in the struggle for justice. She said that the Washington Goldstein Foundation would continue its work, that the next generation was committed to carrying forward the vision that Rachel and Jimmy had articulated. She said that in a world that often seemed to be moving backward, that seemed to be embracing the same patterns of division and hatred that had led to such catastrophe in the past. The story of Rachel and Jimmy was more relevant than ever. She said that their story was a reminder that individual actions mattered, that one person choosing compassion over indifference could save a life and create ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment. She said that their story demonstrated the power of solidarity across different experiences of oppression, the importance of recognizing that all struggles for dignity and justice were connected. And she said that their story was, ultimately, a story of hope, a testament to the possibility of human connection even in the darkest circumstances, a demonstration that the values of compassion and justice could survive and even flourish in the face of systematic evil. Today, more than 75 years after that April day in Dachau, the story of James Washington and Rachel Goldstein continues to be told. The foundation that bears their names has expanded its programs, reaching thousands of students each year, facilitating dialogue between communities, supporting research into the connections between different forms of oppression, and providing scholarships for young people committed to social justice work. The photograph of the two of them together in Tel Aviv in 1973 hangs in the Foundation's office, a visual reminder of what their meeting had meant. But more than any photograph or memorial, their legacy lives on in the lives they touched, the connections they fostered, the example they set of maintaining humanity in the face of dehumanization. Their story reminds us that the struggle against hatred and discrimination is never truly finished, that each generation must renew the commitment to justice and dignity. It reminds us that solidarity across different experiences of oppression is essential to building a more just world. It reminds us that individual acts of kindness and courage, however small they might seem in the moment, can create ripples that transform lives and societies. Most importantly, their story reminds us that human connection can transcend all the artificial barriers that societies erect between people. A Black American soldier and a Jewish woman, brought together by the worst of human evil, demonstrated through their friendship the best of human possibility. They showed that compassion is stronger than hatred, that solidarity is more powerful than division, that the commitment to human dignity can survive and flourish even in the darkest times. In a world that still struggles with racism and anti-Semitism and all forms of discrimination, their story stands as both an indictment of what we allow to persist and an inspiration for what we can achieve. It challenges us to see beyond the categories and divisions, to recognize our common humanity, to choose compassion over indifference, solidarity over isolation, hope over despair. The moment when James Washington cut through the ropes binding Rachel Goldstein to that post in Dachau was not just a moment of liberation for one person, but a moment that demonstrated the possibility of liberation for all people. It was a moment when the fundamental equality and dignity of all human beings was affirmed through action rather than just words. It was a moment that created connections that would last a lifetime and extend into future generations. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.